On December 26, 1991, Americans woke up to the news that the Soviet Union had collapsed. In one of the many Russia-related stories on the front page of the New York Times that day, the death of the USSR was written like an obituary. The Soviet state, marked throughout its brief but tumultuous history by great achievement and terrible suffering, died today after a long and painful decline. It was 74 years old. From the perspective of today, it's hard to think back that far. American politics in 1991 were confused, to say the least. In that year, President George Bush, the now familiar middle initials, H.W., were never used, because his son, the future president, George W. Bush, was then a relatively obscure baseball team owner, had led the U.S. to triumph in the Kuwait War. And then, thanks to the courageous policies of his predecessor Ronald Reagan, Bush oversaw the peaceful demise of the USSR and the end of the Cold War. And yet, despite all of this, his political support was crumbling. Why? Well, his pledge-breaking tax cut didn't help things. The words "read my lips" are now synonymous with "don't believe what's coming out of my lips." But Bush's political eclipse was more than this obvious flip-flop. For one thing, Bush lacked a flair for the dramatic. He didn't have the political instinct to make the most of his own success. So he chose not to make as much as he could have of the February 1991 victory over Iraq, and he made even less of the December 1991 victory over the Soviets. And by 1991 Republicans had been in the White House for more than a decade, and so to many voters, the words "time for a change" seemed like a tonic. Yet if the domestic politics of 1991 were cloudy, the intellectual climate of 1991, at least in terms of international geopolitics, was perfectly clear. The U.S. had won, and that was a victory not only for America, but also for American ideas. Perhaps the most prominent geopolitical voice in those days was that of a U.S. think tanker, Francis Fukuyama. In 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall came down, Fukuyama published the essay "The End of History?" in a small journal, The National Interest. The essay had a massive impact, and the cautionary question mark in the essay's title was soon forgotten, as observers rushed to embrace the clear thrust of Fukuyama's argument, which was that we were seeing the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government.